Hello and welcome back to another Super People weapon breakdown video. Today we're going to be taking a look at all the SMGs in Super People and breaking down their weapon recoil with and without attachments, their DPS, their damage drop off, and then ranking them from best to worst. Now during my testing I found a few really interesting things about the SMGs in this game, so make sure you stick around so you can find out what they are. Now my testing method with this video was the same as our last video. I took each SMG with 30 rounds in the mag, shot it at a specific spot on the wall, both with and without attachments, and no recoil compensation on my end. I then mapped each recoil pattern and put it on an identical canvas so they can be compared side by side. Now before we get into the data, I just want to say thank you for the great feedback on the last video, and I think it's really helped me take this video to the next level. So as always, make sure you drop a comment with any feedback or questions you might have about the video. And now let's get into the data. So let's start with our no attachment recoil chart. Again, I've labeled these from left to right, with left having the least vertical recoil and right having the most vertical recoil. You could make a case for the Uzi and MP5 to be swapped because they're very similar, but I kept the Uzi on the left because it can add recoil compensating attachments, unlike the MP5. I've also labeled each gun's RPM under their name so you get an idea of how fast this recoil is going to be happening. Now the standout gun here is the PPSH, and not for good reasons. While all the other SMGs are relatively easy to control even without any attachments, the PPSH can never have an attachment on it. Now again, the PPSH has a 71 round mag, and this chart here only shows the first 30 bullets. So don't try to mag dump the PPSH, because if you do,
gonna have a bad time.
Now let's take a look at how attachments affect the recoil on the SMGs. Again, the PPSH takes no attachments, and the MP5 can only take a mag and a sight, therefore it has no attachments that can help with recoil. The Uzi, UMP, and Vector both take a grip and a barrel attachment, so we'll be using the SMG compensator on all of these, because the flash hider and the silencer don't provide any sort of recoil compensation. Now for this video, I've added in the recoil maps with the vertical grip and with the angle grip, so you can take a look at them side by side. As expected, we don't see a whole ton of recoil improvement with attachments, but then again, outside of the PPSH, there wasn't a whole lot of recoil to compensate for. The Vector sees the biggest improvement in vertical recoil of about 7 to 8%. The UMP sees about a 3% improvement in vertical recoil, and the Uzi sees maybe a 1 to 2% improvement, but does tighten up its horizontal recoil a little bit. And although the MP5 doesn't take any attachments to help with its recoil, I think it's safe to say it doesn't really need any. Now there's one gun we really need to talk about, and it's not the PPSH, it's the Vector. All the recoil testing with the Vector was done in its full auto mode. Now I'm not sure if everyone even knows this, but the Vector does have a burst fire mode, and believe me, you're gonna wanna see this. So on the left side of your screen is going to be the Vector in its full auto mode. On the right side of the screen is going to be the Vector in its burst fire mode. So let's watch the recoil in full auto. And now let's watch the recoil in burst fire mode. Now this burst fire Vector is so good that I'm honestly not even sure if it's intended to be this way or if this is a bug that I found. But burst fire Vector will take away almost 75% of its total vertical recoil. And since there's no gaps in the burst on the Vector, you can be putting out that full auto damage even when you're on burst fire. So this brings us to the next part of the video, which is the weapon DPS chart. So to get the numbers for this DPS chart, I simply go into the training ground. I take the damage labeled on the gun, I multiply it by its RPM, and then I divide it by 60. I do this for each gun at each crafting tier to get their true DPS. Now the problem with this chart right now is that it's wrong, but it's not my fault. The game is lying to you. Let me explain. Now every weapon in this game has its damage labeled on the bottom and when you ADS. So in theory this UMP should be doing 21.9 damage, and when I shoot a level 0 dummy without armor, it should do exactly 21.9 damage. But watch what happens when I actually shoot him. The gun does 23 damage, and if you're thinking that maybe it's just a bug with the UMP, it's not. It happens with every single SMG and every single tier of each SMG, which means that SMGs are actually about 5% stronger than what the game says they are. So how do I know that the number that shows up in the damage feed is actually the correct number? Well, let me show you. In the training ground, these level 0 dummies have no armor and 100 health, and this uncommon Vector I'm holding does 19.6 damage a shot, which means if I shoot this dummy 5 times, he'll take a total of 98 damage and still be alive. But if he takes the 20.6 damage that the damage feed tells us he is, if I shoot him 5 times, he'll die. So let's test the theory.
Target neutralized.
All right, so now that we know how much damage the SMGs actually do, we can look at the correct DPS chart. And we can finally talk about the gun that completely stands out here. And it's the UMP. It's bad. Like, it's really, really bad. The MP5 does the second least amount of DPS in the SMG category. Although it still does a very respectable amount of damage, it does 22% more than the UMP does across the board. And a common Uzi and common Vector actually outperform a mythical UMP on DPS alone. Just like we saw with the ARs, the common to heroic upgrade sees about a 7 to 9% total improvement in DPS, and the big jumps come again when going from heroic to legendary and then legendary to mythical. The heroic to legendary DPS jump is around 10%, and the legendary to mythical DPS jump is still around 12%. The PPSH sees one of the most laughable damage upgrades I've ever seen from common to uncommon, or it receives a 0.4% DPS upgrade. But now let's circle back to the Vector. If you remember earlier when we talked about the Vector in its burst fire mode, it essentially has no recoil. And when you combine that 0 recoil with the absolute massive damage that the Vector does, it really becomes the standout gun in the SMG class. Now, in my opinion, SMGs should be dumping out huge amounts of damage because of their lack of range. So let's see how they compare DPS-wise to their AR counterparts. And the SMGs overall hold up pretty well against the ARs, with the exception of the UMP, which just still continues to be an incredibly low damage weapon. Now, it's important to remember that this chart shows these guns with no buffs on them, and this would be at a range of 25 meters, so we're not accounting for any damage drop off at this point. Also, I've excluded the G3 from this chart because its DPS is completely unique to every user and how fast they're able to click. And since we already know the damage drop-off for the ARs, let's now take a look at the damage drop-off for the SMGs. To get started, the damage multipliers for SMGs are 1.71 for a headshot and 0.57 for a limb shot. Now at 25 meters, all the SMGs are going to be doing 100% of their base damage still. I've separated out the Uzi from the UMP, Vector, MP5, and PPSH because 25 meters is the max damage range for the Uzi. When we move out to 35 meters, we can see the Uzi has lost about 42% of its headshot damage, 25% of its body damage, and 14% of its limb damage. Now again, 35 meters is the max range for all the other SMGs, but when we move things out to 50 meters, things get a little bit interesting. And we can see at 50 meters, the SMGs have reached their max damage drop-off. What makes this interesting is that it takes the Uzi 25 meters to reach its max damage drop off, while all the other SMGs only take 15 meters to meet their max damage drop off, which is a small win for the Uzi in my book. And remember, none of these numbers account for your opponent's armor. So when you add armor into the equation, these numbers are going to be even lower, which adds to the reason of why you should never be using SMGs at any kind of range. Now, taking everything in this video into consideration, this is how I would personally rank the SMGs in Super People. Coming in at last place for me is the UMP. And while the UMP is really easy to control, it just doesn't do any damage. Its fire rate is way too low, and it just lacks the range that an AR has. And outside of very early game, I really don't see much reason to continue using the UMP. Next up for me is going to be the PPSH. And while I don't think the PPSH is a bad gun by any means, I just think there are better options. The PPSH puts out some pretty good damage and has that 71 round magazine, which is nice for early game and not having to reload. That being said, its lack of attachment spots and its extremely high recoil compared to other SMGs puts it at number 4 for me. I do think this is a really good early game gun, but outside of Strike Force, I don't think I'd use the PPSH as a primary weapon, although I do think it's fine as a secondary. Coming in at number 3 is going to be the MP5. The MP5 is a very reliable SMG that I know a lot of people love. Its built-in suppressor is nice, and not taking a grip or compensator is not really that big of a deal because it doesn't have much recoil. The reason the MP5 is in spot number 3 is because the other two just really outclass it when it comes to damage. That being said, I see no issues running this as your secondary weapon, and absolutely no problem if you're a Strike Force and this is your primary weapon. Coming in at number 2 for me is going to be the Uzi. The big benefits of the Uzi are its absolutely minimal recoil and huge damage output. Where the Uzi falls short is its damage range. It's the only SMG where the damage drop-off starts at 25 meters, where all the others start at 35 meters. But all in all, the Uzi is an absolute monster up close, and its ability to put out out a ton of damage in such a short amount of time, lands it at number 2 on my list. And coming in at number 1 for me is the Vector. When you look at the numbers, this gun just has to be number 1. It has the highest DPS output of all the SMGs, and as we saw in its burst fire mode, almost no recoil. Now we all know the major flaw of the Vector is the 19 round base mag, but even with that 19 round base mag, when you look at the damage and the recoil, there's just absolutely no way I can't rank the Vector at number 1. And that concludes our Super People SMG breakdown video. This one took a lot of time, so I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, thank you so much for the positive feedback on the first video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this one even more. The DMR video is currently in the works, but if you guys have ideas for future videos, just let me know in the comments. And make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for future Super People content. Also, going forward, I'm going to be posting a lot of this information before it goes on YouTube on my Patreon. So if you want to join that, you can find the link in the description. I also stream on Twitch Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. EST. So if you want to ask me a question live, you can always find me there. Again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.